Chronicles of Europe contain one of the most gruesome chapters in the history of medicine. These are pages where medical treatises coexist with violence, and practices that seem unthinkable today are hidden under the guise of treatment. It was believed that in order to cure a man of leprosy or the plague, it was necessary to transfer the disease to a girl's body. And so little girls, often not even reaching puberty, became living medicine, objects of violence, legalized by religious and medical rhetoric. This myth about the healing power of virgins permeated medical practice, the advice of court physicians, and the speeches of priests who justified the suffering of children by claiming that their sacrifice was supposedly saving men's lives. To understand how this became possible, we need to look at the context of the time. 14th and 15th century Europe lived in the shadow of epidemics. The plague claimed millions of lives, leprosy destroyed bodies and souls, and syphilis, which arrived later, caused panic and a thirst for any means of treatment. Traditional medicine was based on a mixture of ancient texts, biblical interpretations, and superstitions. The human body was seen as a vessel filled with fluids, blood, bile, and phlegm. An imbalance of these fluids was considered the source of disease, and when disease could not be cured by bloodletting and prayer, desperate doctors found an explanation in the idea that disease could be transferred to another, purer body. Paradoxically, it was virginity, a symbol of innocence and untouched purity, that became the key to this monstrous method. Medical treatises copied in the university centers of Bologna, Paris, and Salamanca often mentioned that touching a virgin's body could calm the fever. In some cases, this was referred to as contact. But behind the medical euphemism lay the practice of rape, often committed with the tacit approval of the church or secular authorities. There are known documents where the list of remedies for leprosy included the recommendation, union with an unspoiled maiden. Such records are found in 15th century manuscripts preserved in monastery libraries in southern France and northern Italy. They are particularly common in the context of wealthy patients, people who had the resources to obtain the medicine at the cost of someone else's life. The poor had no access to doctors or to girls who could be bought from desperate families. In a time when girls aged 10, 11, or 12 were considered marriageable, their bodies had virtually no legal protection. Parents, fearing infection from a sick husband or hoping for payment for the sacrifice, often agreed. Sources record that in German lands and in what is now the Czech Republic, such practices took on the character of a ritual. It was believed that the act of treatment should be accompanied by prayer and consecration. The paradox is that religion, which proclaimed purity, became an instrument of legitimizing violence. The images of these practices are horrific. A girl would be locked in the sick man's chambers, where she would be prescribed sexual intercourse as a cure. Some chronicles mention that after the act, doctors would monitor the man's condition and record a reduction in fever. But behind this dry medical description lay screams, blood, and broken lives. Girls often died from the effects of violence, or from contracting the disease itself, because the belief in transfer meant that the infection had to pass into her body. These practices were not widespread in a statistical sense, but they were indicative. They demonstrate how the despair of the era, the lack of effective medicines, and a belief in mysticism made institutionalized violence possible. In treatises, doctors wrote about virgin purity as a substance capable of absorbing the poison of disease. Monastic instructions warned that sin was coupled with healing, but such caveats only emphasized that the practice was known and discussed. It is noteworthy that similar ideas appeared not only in Europe. Arab medical texts from the 11th century mention the healing power of virginity, although direct sexual exploitation is less frequently recorded there. But it was the European context, with its epidemics and social collapse, that made this myth a tool for justifying barbarism. In the 14th century, during the Black Death, when death was ravaging entire cities, Despair intensified the spread of such beliefs. The higher the mortality rate, the more actively rumors spread about miraculous methods, including the use of children's bodies as medicine. The fates of the victims remained virtually unknown. History records the names of the doctors who promoted such methods, and the names of the rulers who allowed the practice under their supervision. But the names of the girls themselves disappeared, dissolving into anonymity. We know that in England at the end of the 14th century, methods of treating leprosy among the nobility were discussed at the court of Edward III, and one letter mentions an attempt to heal through a maiden. German chronicles contain evidence of court cases where parents were accused of selling a child for medical purposes, but even there, the girl's voice is not heard. The most frightening thing is to realize that this practice wasn't perceived as a crime. It was considered a medical experiment, an act of desperation, sometimes even a pious sacrifice. Against the backdrop of a lack of understanding of the nature of infections and microbes, the belief in transferring the disease to girls seemed logical. And it was precisely this logic that led to hundreds of children being broken or killed in a process called treatment. The history of therapeutic rape is not just a story about medicine. It is a story about power, male, religious, political. Power that allowed men's bodies to be saved at the expense of girls' bodies. And this is only the beginning of a picture in which the sacrifice of children became part of a monstrous alliance of science, fear, and violence. When we look deeper into the context of those times, it becomes clear that the main mechanism for legitimizing such practices was the system of power, ecclesiastical and academic. Medical treatises and theological arguments worked hand in hand to form a language that justified what we now call child abuse. Medieval universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Padua, were centers not only of learning, but also of authoritative consolidation of medical dogma. Medical texts were often based on ancient authorities, Galen, Avicenna, Hippocrates, but their interpretation took place in conditions where fear of death and epidemics was much stronger than logic. In one of the medical treatises of the 14th century, now kept in the library of Montpellier, there is a direct statement: if the body is affected by rot, it should be cleansed through union with a clean body. The word connection, Latin conjunctio, leaves no doubt that the sexual act was meant. The Church took a dual position on this issue. On the one hand, official councils condemned extramarital sexual relations, especially when they involved children. On the other hand, strange and disturbing reservations appeared in private sermons and pastoral instructions. For example, in the notes of a 14th century Bavarian priest, we read, "If a man is afflicted by illness and his wife is unable to heal him, a virgin may be sacrificed for the salvation of his soul." Here, the virgin is treated as a sacrificial animal offered on the altar of medicine. Secular authorities also participated in consolidating these practices. Royal and princely courts often invited university doctors, and it was in these elite circles that the idea of healing unions found application. In England, during the reign of Edward III, chronicles record that some sick men of the nobility received special treatment. And although there are few documents that explicitly mention violence against virgins, indirect references are too numerous to be considered a coincidence. The structure of society itself played a special role, where childhood as a category practically did not exist. A girl at the age of 10 or 12 could be considered ready for marriage and childbearing. This opened a loophole for doctors and theologians. If her body was already considered ready, then the act of violence became marital likeness in their eyes. Parents under pressure from need or threats often agreed. An important factor was economic. Virginity in medieval Europe had real market value. In some markets, especially in port cities, girls were sold as pure servants to wealthy households. Here too, medicine intervened. A girl destined for treatment could fetch a higher price than a servant. This is how a market for human bodies was formed, where medicine became a customer for violence. There are surviving court documents. In Nuremberg, at the end of the 15th century, a case was heard concerning the death of an 11-year-old girl who died a few weeks after staying in the home of a leper merchant. The parents claimed that she had been given away for healing, while the doctor stated that it was a necessary measure. The judge found the parents guilty not of selling their daughter, but only of putting her in danger without proper payment. This decision shows how blurred the line was between violence and medical experimentation. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that girls who underwent such treatment were often isolated after the violence. If they survived, they often fell ill themselves, infected with leprosy, syphilis, or other diseases. But society did not see them as victims, but as unclean. They could be sent to leper colonies, monasteries, or simply banished. Thus, the victim was punished twice. First, her body was used as medicine. Then she was accused of losing her purity. Documents from the Inquisition trials confirmed that rumors of such practices caused fear and outrage. Sometimes parents complained. Sometimes monks raised the issue. But these voices were drowned out by the general fear of epidemics. When the life of a noble man was at stake, society was willing to turn a blind eye to the death of a child. Interestingly, doctors themselves sometimes defended their practices with terms of religious sacrifice. In one of the manuscripts found in Austria, there is a record: "As a lamb accepts the knife for redemption, so a maiden accepts suffering for the healing of another." These lines sound like a blatant theological substitution. Violence was presented as a form of sacred act. Gradually, a whole layer of superstition developed around this idea. Folk tales claimed that the disease comes out with the virgin's blood, that the fever of the plague passes into the girl's body. In some parts of Europe, there were even magical rituals in which the act of violence was accompanied by prayers and incantations. Medicine, religion, and magic became intertwined in a terrible alliance where the suffering of a child became part of therapy. This was not an isolated failure, but a systemic phenomenon. The power of universities, the authority of the church, and the desire to survive created conditions where a girl's body was the last resort, the last medicine. And this makes the picture even more frightening. We are not talking about secret crimes, but about practices that, although hushed up, were embedded in the social and medical fabric of the era. When Europe entered the early modern era, it would seem that with the flourishing of university medicine and the development of anatomy, such practices should have disappeared. But this did not happen. The myth of the healing contact with a virgin not only persisted, but also transformed, continuing to exist in different strata of society. The 17th century, the century of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, seemed to be a time of rationalization and the fight against superstition. But it was precisely then that belief in virgin medicine reached its peak among the nobility and wealthy townspeople. In France, during the reign of Louis XIV, there are records of court physicians who advised removing the fever of the disease through virgin contact. Although official medicine was gradually shifting toward ideas about body mechanics and blood circulation, doctors still used traditional recipes in their daily practice. The archives of the Paris Medical College contain records describing cases where aristocrats suffering from syphilis were prescribed a maiden. The documents used veiled terms such as cura per intactam, treatment through the untouched. 17th century England knew similar stories through popular rumors. Chronicles mention cases where sick London merchants sought pure virgins to cure them of venereal diseases. In the satirical literature of the time, such practices became the subject of ridicule. Writers mentioned old men who chased after healing innocents. But behind the satire lay reality. Girls were victims of systematic violence, disguised as medical necessity. The myth was particularly dramatic in Central and Eastern Europe. In 17th century Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia, There were cases in which parents were accused of selling their daughters to sick people. These cases often went to court, but as in the Middle Ages, the punishments were lenient or non-existent. If a girl survived, she became an outcast. She was considered spoiled and infected with disease. In some cases, the practice of therapeutic rape became part of a ritual that was close to magic. In German lands, there was a belief that illness came out with a virgin's first cry. Therefore, the act of violence itself took on the character of a spell, and doctors recorded signs that supposedly confirmed that healing had begun. Such rituals were performed in secret, but were known to the community. This is why Protestant sermons of the 17th century often mention the devilish belief in maiden blood. The paradox was that even with advances in medicine, the myth persisted. With the development of anatomy and the first autopsies, doctors began to understand the nature of diseases. But when it came to incurable ailments such as syphilis or leprosy, they still resorted to superstitious methods. Virginity continued to be seen as a resource, as a substance with cleansing powers. These practices can also be traced in colonial contexts. When European doctors found themselves in colonies, in Africa, America, Asia, they brought with them the same set of superstitions. There is evidence that in the Caribbean and South America, European settlers practiced healing acts on local girls, believing that this would save them from tropical fevers. Thus, violence under the guise of treatment became part of colonial exploitation. From the 17th century onwards, critics became increasingly vocal. Some scholars openly called these methods superstition and blasphemy. The Venetian physician Girolamo Gabrieli wrote that belief in the healing power of virgins was unfounded and caused only suffering. But even such voices were drowned out by a sea of despair. Where death seemed inevitable, society continued to seek salvation in the most monstrous forms. Documents from the period record a horrific detail. Young girls were selected for wealthy patients based on the belief that the purer, the stronger the medicine. This led to children as young as 6, 7, and 8 becoming victims. For doctors, it was an experiment. For parents, it was a source of income or a way to please powerful patrons. For girls, it was an indescribable nightmare. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that women and children had almost no legal voice. In court, the girls' words were not taken seriously, and parents could easily justify themselves by claiming that they did not know the consequences. Thus, responsibility was dissolved, and the practice continued for decades. It is important to note that the very idea of transferring disease persisted in broader medical superstitions. For example, it was believed that disease could be transmitted through clothing, touch, or kissing. The belief in the possibility of transferring infection made it plausible to transfer it to the body of a virgin. This context explains why society could accept such practices as something logical, albeit frightening. Thus, the 17th century did not mark the end of this story. On the contrary, the myth of the healing power of virginity took root and became part of both the medical and social landscape of Europe. And if in the Middle Ages it existed at the intersection of religion and folk medicine, it now took on new forms, becoming part of colonial policy and an instrument of violence in an era that is considered the beginning of the Enlightenment. By the 18th century, Europe was already entering the age of enlightenment. Ideas of rationalism were spreading in universities, and doctors were increasingly talking about the need for experimentation and verification rather than superstition and divine miracles. But it was precisely at this time that the myth of the healing virgin did not disappear, but changed its form. It ceased to be part of official medical practice and gradually moved into the realm of secret recipes, folk superstitions, and underground medical methods that were passed down by word of mouth. The emergence of new diseases, especially syphilis, played a fatal role. Syphilis, which swept across Europe from the end of the 15th century and by the 18th century had become one of the main threats, could not be treated with conventional means. Mercury, which was used to burn it out, often killed patients faster than the disease itself. In this context, rumors about miraculous methods spread particularly quickly. Medical notes from that time contain references to contact with the innocent as a last hope. Even if doctors did not openly include such methods in their treatises, they continued to circulate in private conversations and correspondence. An important element was that the idea of the healing act shifted from the image of the Virgin as a completely pure vessel to the cult of maiden blood. In some regions of Europe, there was a belief that the first blood of menstruation, or the blood shed during defloration, had special healing powers. It was believed that it could draw out the poison of disease, or bind the fever. Therefore, violence against children and adolescents was accompanied by rituals of blood collection. The chronicles of East Prussia mentioned cases where sick people were given the blood of girls who had lost their purity to drink. Religious discourse did not disappear either, but it changed. The Catholic Church officially condemned such practices, but in private sermons in rural parishes, there were still references to the idea that innocence can atone for illness. Protestant communities, on the other hand, accused Catholics of devilish belief in maiden flesh, but at the same time, practices of violence under the guise of treatment secretly existed in the same German principalities. It was a strange dualism, publicly denying but secretly preserving. Court cases from the 18th century show that society was beginning to take a more critical view of these practices, but the victims still remained unprotected. The archives in Vienna contain a case of a sick aristocrat who, according to his servants, raped a 13-year-old girl on the advice of a doctor. When everything came to light, the doctor was dismissed, but the aristocrat himself was not punished. The girl was sent to a convent for purification. In England, especially in 18th century London, secret medical circles emerged where similar experiments were practiced. Medical journals did not officially refer to virgins as medicine, but in so-called home instructions for the treatment of syphilis, there are phrases disguised as euphemisms: apply an innocent remedy, or take advantage of an untouched body. These texts circulated in manuscript form, passed from doctor to doctor. Colonial contexts reinforced the spread of the myth. In India and Africa, Europeans often tried to use local girls as a cure for tropical fevers. One of the reports of the East India Company in the 18th century mentions a scandal in which British officers practiced healing acts with local children. Formerly, this was condemned, but in fact it was hushed up. It is curious that in the educational literature of the time, the myth of the healing virgin began to appear as a symbol of obscurantism. French philosophers, such as Voltaire, wrote satirical pamphlets mocking superstition in maiden flesh. But behind this satire lay a reality. Even if the image became a subject of ridicule, the practices themselves continued to exist on the fringes of medicine and in the shadows of wealthy homes. The most frightening thing is that the idea of therapeutic rape in the 18th century became intertwined with early forms of racism and colonial exploitation. European settlers considered the bodies of others, African and Native American girls, to be especially pure and strong. Their bodies became not only objects of sexual exploitation, but also symbols of a medical resource available to white men. At the same time, it was in the 18th century that the first medical societies began to form, where open criticism of such practices was voiced. But this was the voice of a minority. Most of society continued to live in fear of disease, and the myth that innocence heals persisted. It was increasingly referred to as a secret remedy or last resort, but it remained part of a grim tradition rooted in the Middle Ages. Thus, in the 18th century, we see a dual picture. On the one hand, there was the flourishing of science, the first experiments with vaccination, and the first attempts to explain diseases through microscopy. On the other hand, there was the shadow of an old myth which, although banished from official texts, continued to live on in practice and in society. It was a century when medicine was beginning to emerge as a science, but at the same time continued to bear the stigma of superstition, for which children paid the price. The 19th century is considered the time of the final victory of science over obscurantism. This was when laboratories appeared, along with the first systematic clinical studies, Louis Pasteur, and Joseph Lister's theory of microbes, vaccination, and antiseptics. It would seem that superstitions, such as belief in the healing act with a virgin, should have disappeared completely. But history has shown the opposite. The myth did not die, it merely changed form. It moved from university lectures to the realm of secret councils, folk practices, and even certain medical communities, where despair still made possible what official medicine had already rejected. Victorian England in the mid-19th century knew this myth very well. In a society where Puritan morality reigned supreme, there was a paradoxical belief that sex with a virgin could cure a man of syphilis and gonorrhea. Of course, this was not written about in the newspapers, but hints were sometimes made in private medical consultations, a remedy available only to the pure. Sick rich men sold out young girls and children, considering them a medicine. The police recorded cases where families sold their daughters under the guise of servants, but in fact for the secret treatment of wealthy clients. Parliamentary reports from the late 19th century mention that some doctors unofficially advised the use of girls' bodies as a last resort. Particularly alarming was the fact that in England, the myth became part of a wider problem of child prostitution. In late 19th century London, there were entire networks of child trafficking, and it was the belief in healing contact that fueled the demand. Girls aged 12, 11, and sometimes even 9 were bought specifically for the purpose of treating wealthy patients. In 1885, a scandal erupted when journalist William Thomas Stead published an investigation into the purchase of a 13-year-old girl for the healing of a syphilis patient. The scandal shocked society and led to reforms in child protection laws and an increase in the age of consent. But the very fact that such a thing was considered acceptable shows that the myth was alive and well. In 19th century Europe, it also existed in a colonial context. European doctors working in India, Africa, and China recorded cases in their private diaries where colonial officials demanded virgin medicine. In the colonies, this superstition took an even more brutal form. Local girls were raped not only for the treatment of syphilis, but also for protection against tropical diseases. Doctors working for the British East India Company knew about such cases but rarely intervened, calling them cultural practices of white society. On the continent in the 19th century, the myth increasingly turned into folk wisdom. In German and Austrian villages, expressions such as "the sick need contact with a clean body" were common. Medical archives contain testimonies from peasant families who claimed that a doctor advised them to give their child to heal an old man. In Poland and Hungary, similar stories existed until the beginning of the 20th century. Girls were given away as the last chance to save their husbands. The emergence of psychiatry and interest in sexuality in the late 19th century made the myth a subject of scientific discussion. Some psychiatrists mentioned the superstition about the virgin cure as an example of pathological beliefs in society. But the very fact that this was discussed in scientific journals shows that the practice had not yet disappeared. Doctors had to explain that virginity had no cleansing power. It is particularly telling that at the beginning of the 20th century, the myth resurfaced in South Africa during outbreaks of syphilis and tuberculosis. There, European colonists spread the belief among local men that sex with a virgin would protect them from disease. This idea gradually turned into a persistent superstition, which would later be called the virgin myth of HIV treatment at the end of the 20th century. Thus, a story that began in medieval Europe unexpectedly survived the centuries and took on a new form. In the 19th century, Europe increasingly faced the exposure of such practices. Journalists, writers, and public figures published investigations into child prostitution, and doctors who used children under the guise of medicine. These publications caused a wave of outrage and contributed to the adoption of new laws. But even when society had already labeled such acts crimes, the practice continued to exist on the fringes, in closed clinics and colonies. Thus, the history of therapeutic rape came full circle. Beginning as a medical superstition in the Middle Ages, it survived the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Victorian era. It became part of cultural memory, a symbol of how despair and power can turn a child's body into medicine. And although science finally drove these practices out of official medicine, their traces remain. Traces in archives, court cases, newspaper investigations, and most importantly, in the fates of nameless girls whom history has deprived of their right to a voice. This myth has lived too long to be dismissed as a coincidence. It was not simply a consequence of ignorance, but a product of a systemic social structure where male life was valued above the innocence of children, and therein lies its darkest and most terrifying essence.